Welcome to The Point. I'm Mindy Todd. Today we continue our series of debates leading up to the general election on November 8th. Today, candidates running for district attorney for the Cape and Islands, and the candidates are Democrat Robert Galibois and Republican Daniel Higgins. Welcome to you both. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, Mindy. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right, so just a reminder of our format, up to 2 minutes to answer questions, and we will have 2 minutes for closing comments at the end. And we'll start alphabetically, so we'll start with you, Robert Galibois. And the question is, why do you believe you're the best candidate for the job? What skill set or experience do you bring to the table?
Well, again, thank you, Mindy, for having us this morning, as well as WCAI. And thank you for Mr. Higgins for being here as well. For your listening audience, my name is Rob Galibois. I am the Democratic candidate for the Cape and Islands District Attorney's Office. When we launched this campaign in early January, we were fortunate to gain the support of our honorary chair, Dan Wolf. And Dan Wolf described the district attorney's role as crucially important. He said it's a unique opportunity to protect the citizenry by building a community that is both secure and safe. To me, this campaign is personal. My wife and I got married in the mid-'90s, and we chose to live on the Cape. Both of our boys were born here on the Cape at Cape Cod Hospital. I have served on many boards and committees here on the Cape for several years. And over my 27 years of practice, I've been a consistent and regular presence throughout our entire court system. I've practiced as a prosecutor, where I've handled some of the more serious cases brought to trial in the Superior Court, ranging from mayhem, sexual assaults, and drug distributions. And I've handled major felonies across the Commonwealth as a defense attorney, including 15 homicides as a lead prosecutor. I've had the benefit of seeing what other district attorneys' offices do across the Commonwealth, tools that are available to target drug traffickers and heroin, fentanyl, and meth that are not being used here in the Cape. I've seen court sessions, specialty court sessions that run mental health, and veteran sessions that are not run here on the Cape that I would endeavor to launch. I am a believer of POST, Peace Officer Standardized Training. Massachusetts is the last state to adopt this particular commission, and it trains police officers and engages in police reform. I will forever protect a woman's right, what I call fundamental fairness, for reproductive health.
Thank you very much. Daniel Higgins, same question.
Good morning, Mindy. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Mr. Galibois, for being here as well. My name is Dan Higgins. I'm running for district attorney for the Cape and Islands. I've been a prosecutor for 13 years, serving the people of the Cape and Islands, working in public service and working for public safety here. During those 13 years, I've prosecuted every type of case, up to and including murder. I have supervised the 5 district courts for approximately 7 years. I've led a team of 10 prosecutors during that time, training them and supervising them across the district courts in Falmouth, Barnstable, Orleans, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. I love this job. I grew up here in the summers in Dennis, as did my mother at the same house, and I had a call to public service. I went to law school to become a prosecutor. I was working in Dorchester District Court my last year of law school under a special rule. And during that time, it confirmed for me what I wanted to do. I sent my resume around. I didn't know anyone here in this district attorney's office, didn't know the DA, the first assistant, but I was lucky to be hired. And what resonates with me today is still why I'm in this job, because our job is to do the right thing. That's what Mike O'Keefe told me when I was hired by his team of prosecutors. And that means a lot to me. I believe in treating people as individuals. I believe in being fair to people, ensuring we protect their rights, and also public safety. I believe that incarceration is necessary for the people who won't listen to our judges and our probation officers. And I also believe in diversion for those minor offenses where a defendant is young, made a mistake out of human frailty, and is willing to work with us. I come here with experience. I live in West Barnstable with my wife and my son. This is my home, and I've stepped forward to run for district attorney.
Thank you very much. Next question, we'll start with you, Daniel Higgins. We just heard a mention of specialty courts, and for listeners who aren't sure what that is, specialty courts, problem-solving court sessions that provide court-supervised probation and required treatment. They've been used increasingly the last few years throughout the country. These courts focus on things like substance use disorder, what we call drug courts, mental health courts, veterans courts. I believe currently we only have drug court, a specialty court on the Cape. Is that right? You're not? Okay.
Yes.
So what would you like to see other specialty courts on the Cape, and if so, which ones?
I'm open to the idea, Mindy, but what I'll say is drug court was created at the Barnstable District Courthouse. It was done with support from our office, certainly. It is a court function to create those specialty courts. The DA can encourage it, but ultimately the court system is up to them. We have participated in the drug court for years. We assign a special prosecutor to that session. They are in charge of every Friday going there and listening to the status of those people who are in there for a year and a half, who ultimately we hope graduate from the program. The goal is to fix their issue and to prevent recidivism. So right there, the interest of the community and the interest of the individual, I say, dovetail nicely. Because as prosecutors, we want to protect the public and reduce crime. And for the individual, we want them to get treatment. And sometimes it's the first person who cared, who offered that treatment and acted almost in locus parenti, as a parent. That judge talks to them very personally every Friday and monitors them over the bumps along the way. There's been talk about mental health courts and veteran courts. Right now, for years, we've currently referred defendants to off-Cape specialty courts, Brockton for Veterans Court, Plymouth for Mental Health Court. We have that ability, and we do so. But we also keep people out of the system completely, because these specialty courts are for people who are often on probation, who are facing the potential for jail. With mental health, we screen it as prosecutors at arraignment. Police give us information they learn from family members on scene. They alert us, and we then summons the court clinician. We ask the judge to call the court clinician to come evaluate them. And that might be for a section if they need to go inpatient. That might be for competency to stand trial. And ultimately, later on, it may be for criminal responsibility. But we deal with those cases sometimes on a pre-arraignment or predisposition basis. And what I would suggest is Veterans Court is also a wonderful thing. It is a numbers thing. I've met with the court. Right now, they believe the numbers don't hold here for enough participants. We send them to the Brockton Court.
Thank you very much. Same question, Robert Galibois.
These specialty courts are vital, and as you indicated, Mindy, they exist in counties throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we started talking early on in our campaign and trying to launch these specialty sessions in our district court. And I've gained the support of Attorney General Maura Healey, who recently endorsed our campaign, and she's given us the blessing in making these particular efforts to bring these types of specialty sessions to the district courts. As you might imagine, in a mental health specialty court, professionals in the field come in and work with the defendant and actually try to get to the core issue that they're struggling with and try to treat that issue. The professionals work with the judges, the defense attorneys, the prosecutors, the probation department to, again, address that core issue, which ultimately reduces recidivism and keeps us safe. It is definitely a great tool for public safety. In a similar vein, veterans court sessions. A veteran brings his own or her own uniqueness when they are ensnarled in the criminal justice system. We in Barnstable County are blessed. We have the largest veterans population in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have this massive pool of veterans that we can call upon to come into the courtroom, work with the judges, the probation department, the prosecutors, and the defense attorneys, and with that struggling veteran to, again, get to the core issue with the goal of trying to treat it and reduce recidivism and therefore keep us safe.
All right, thank you. Robert Galibois, we'll start with you this time. Drugs are and have been a huge issue for some time now. We see substance use and abuse driving other crimes. While the job of the DA's office is prosecuting crime, it's also to protect public safety and encourage prevention and education. How do you feel the DA's office can help with this issue of substance abuse and crime?
Okay, so this is where I would suggest my experience in practicing in other courts comes into play. I get to see other district attorneys' offices utilizing tools that this DA's office does not use in cases involving trafficking in fentanyl, heroin, and meth. And specifically, I'm talking about when you get to these drug trafficking levels, you can try to hold these people without bail. It's called a dangerousness hearing. And the dangerousness hearing statute provides in cases where you have drug trafficking levels that have minimum mandatories of 3.5 years or more, you can try to hold those people, that is, keep them in jail during the pendency of their case. Additionally, there is a tool used by every DA's office across the Commonwealth that I've never seen in my 27 years here. And it's basically a statute that, when put into play by a prosecutor, requires a judge to give consecutive sentences. That is, every defendant will be punished separately for the crime that they have committed. There are no package deals, so to speak. And these are really important tools to utilize when you try to take on the drug traffickers and those that are running around with unlawful guns.
Thank you. Same question, Daniel Higgins.
Thank you, Mindy. Our office use mandatory minimums for drug traffickers, and we enforce them. We indict them. The grand jury evaluates the case. They're prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law in Superior Court. And we also use the Armed Career Criminal Statute, which enhances and adds penalties for those previously convicted of crimes, and it ratchets up based on their record. We use that statute. We used that recently with respect to the murderer of Sergeant Sean Gannon. I believe that person received a 10 to 15-year sentence that they're serving now before their life sentence even starts. This office enforces the law. And respectfully, my opponent is coming from the defense attorney angle. For the last approximately 20 years, he's been representing defendants privately, including drug dealers, and including here on Cape Cod. Respectfully, I think the voters need to be aware of that. They need to take into consideration how each one of us has devoted their law degree. I've devoted it to public safety on Cape Cod. We can always look at how aggressively we're prosecuting drug dealers, and we can always look for improvements. But education, as you mentioned, Mindy, is sometimes the missing component. We can't stop fentanyl from coming in from Mexico completely. It's small, it's tiny, it can be secreted. It's going to come onto the Cape, no matter how many car stops are made or drug investigations there are, because there is so much profit to be made. What we need to do, and I like to suggest a third of each, we need to devote our time and attention as a DA's office to educating in the schools, and we need to devote our time and attention to supporting treatment that is out there through these nonprofit organizations. We use our discretionary funds at the DA's office to support many of these good causes across the Cape, whether it goes towards homelessness, drug treatment, etc. And we try to use the limited funds we have to support those programs and get them on their feet. I would suggest we need to take a three-pronged attack at the drug problem.
I need to respond to that if I can.
You have a minute.
Please.
Yep, a minute.
Okay, if I can respond to that. Most respectfully, in the past 2.5 years, going back to about the middle of 2019 to present, this office, when he talks about going after drug traffickers and imposing minimum mandatories, has broken down drug trafficking cases involving heroin, fentanyl, and meth 18 times. That is 18 separate drug dealers in heroin, meth, and fentanyl that this office has said, we're going to do away with the minimum mandatories. And in many of those cases, they allow the person to walk out with probation. So most respectfully, when they say that this office goes forward with grand jury and indicting people and imposing minimum mandatories, that, in fact, is not reality.
You want another minute?
Thank you. It's easy to say that. It's easy to look up cases and for Mr. Galibois to just pull the final disposition. There's a thing called suppression of evidence in cases. There's a thing called other witnesses who may be charged as well, who are willing to testify against the target drug dealer of an investigation, the upper drug dealer, if you will. Those are the realities of prosecution. We have to prove cases beyond a reasonable doubt. We do what we think is best for the public. We're not out there breaking down cases left and right because that'll help the public. We're trying to secure a conviction for those dealing drugs on this Cape and the islands and punish them accordingly. We take a firm stance on drug trafficking. I would do that going forward. We also use the Armed Career Criminal Statute to enhance those penalties. We
are talking with the candidates who are running for the Cape and Islands District Attorney, Democrat Robert Galibois and Republican Daniel Higgins. 866-999-4626 is our number. If you have a question to pose to both candidates, 866-999-4626. Our email address, thepoint@capeandislands.org. We'll talk more after break. You're listening to The Point. With us this morning are the candidates running for district attorney for the Cape and Islands. Candidates are Democrat Robert Galibois and Republican Daniel Higgins. And Daniel Higgins, your turn to go first. We just talked a little bit about prevention and education, focused on the drug problem. But what other areas do you see opportunity for prevention and education?
Mindy, I think the drug issue with the opiates is the biggest opportunity there. I'm looking at what's called the hub model. It's a Canadian model they recently employed in Plymouth. It's meant to bring together all the treatment providers at the county level. It's also a good idea because it can try and pool statistics, overdoses in certain towns, where the resources should be offered and targeted to a population that has a use issue. So that is something I'm looking at. I'm going to speak with the county about. We have what's called a critical management system at our office that our office paid for and has yearly funded since we purchased the program. We have almost every police department on Cape Cod signed on to it. The goal is for them to enter an overdose into that system, and then it alerts the PD of the town which the person resides in. So if the overdose is downtown Hyannis, they may live in Dennis. The outreach team from Dennis PD can then go to that residence and offer treatment services not only to that individual, but to the roommates or family members who might also have substance issues within the home because of the presence of opiates. I'm also looking at the need in our juvenile court. Juvenile court doesn't get a lot of attention, and that's partly because of the privacy issue. It's not out there in the newspaper, so we're not marking these juveniles with public criminal charges in their youth. There's a reason for that. So in our juvenile courts, while there's not a lot of media attention paid to it because it's not public, there is a lack of resources. I think we need a regimented program that we can offer for these students that is more than just putting them on probation or asking them to work with DCF. So I'm looking at that. I'd like to bring in people from all different professions, financial literacy, fire, police, doctors, and provide some education within that, because that is a restorative court, not a punitive one. So that is another area I'm looking at to devote some resources for education, Mindy, to the juveniles.
Thank you. Robert Galibois, same question.
In talking with folks that work with the recovery courts, there's been a lot of conversation of trying to bring in recovery coaches actually right into the courtroom to work with the parties and players in the courtroom, and certainly the defendant, to help them through their recovery process. As this campaign's been going along, I've taken a lot of meetings with the Duffy Center and Column Health and Bayview and Peer Recovery. And what's often mentioned, Mindy, is the huge elephant that's in the room. We don't have any sort of residential treatment programs in the Mid-Cape to Lower Cape area, nor on the islands. So we try to figure out how we got to get there to launch residential treatment programs. And the conversations always turn towards trying to put a focus group together. And the focus group would include certainly professionals in the field. You try to pull in some local elected officials like your select board members and your state representatives and your state senators. And you also need to pull in private investors that would be willing to welcome these opportunity. And this is something that is direly needed in the Upper Cape area and the Middle Cape and the Lower Cape area. So it's not a traditional role, Mindy, for a district attorney to participate in this type of focus group, but with the opioid crisis been going on for so long now, it's not traditional times.
Yeah. All right, Robert Galibois, we start with you this time. Karen in Harwich has a question. She said, how would you deal with racial and ethnic disparities? Would you make a priority the development of a system to identify and challenge racial bias within the criminal justice system?
It came to our attention early in the campaign of a study that was released, I believe, from 2015, that talked about how the African-American population on the Cape comprises approximately 3% of the overall population, but yet makes up about 25% of the pretrial detention population at the local jail. And I mentioned back then that's not simply a disparity. That's an outright failure of the system. And to try to address it, our campaign has talked about how you need to collect data. You need to see what you are doing so that you can then go back and try to analyze the data and see how you can do something better. And I think an ongoing problem is the data is just not simply kept. The data needs to be gathered. It needs to be scrutinized by the prosecuting office as well as the public. That particular data needs to be released so the public can weigh in and say, hey, this is what's going on. This is how we think we can do it better.
Thank you. Same question, Daniel Higgins.
I think that is an important topic as a community, and it's more than just the DA's office that needs to be involved in that discussion. First, I am aware of some studies both ways talking about traffic stops, whether there's racial disparity, as well as in the jail population. One thing that I would support is the court system becoming the data collector. So what we do here, in my role as a prosecutor, in Rob's role as a criminal defense attorney, what we do is an adversarial process. we sometimes can come to agreements, but often we can't. The client controls the defendant, and it ultimately may be a trial because the Commonwealth's seeking a penalty the defendant is not willing to accept, as is the case with sometimes drug traffickers. And what I would suggest is if we as a prosecutor start interviewing defendants, we can't do that. They're represented often by attorneys, sometimes they're pro se, and police, when they're in that adversarial process of booking someone who may be upset they were arrested, oftentimes defendants won't give racial data to the police. They'll give them an answer they're unhappy with because they don't want to be there. And then the police are left to guess based on the appearance of someone, and that is wrong. I may identify differently than I appear. However, the court is in a neutral position. They do intakes of everyone who is arraigned at the court. So what they could do as the neutral party is they could be the record keeper and ask the defendant how they identify racially. That would give us some data that starts to be reliable. And then the tough question as a society is interpreting that data, because there are other issues, that, such as socioeconomic ones, which may play in here that we need to devote some resources to. I would suggest the court should be collecting this data, and then we could deem it somewhat reliable as compared to if an attorney is reporting it or a police officer guessing based on a photograph. That's not right.
If I can respond to that, please. It doesn't have to be the court. And that's how far behind the Cape and Islands District Attorney's Office is. This already goes on. Middlesex County, Suffolk County, the Northwest District, which is Hampshire and Franklin County, those DA's offices keep the data and they share it through an annual report. So it doesn't have to be the court.
If I could, Mindy, I don't believe in painting by the numbers. If the DA's office keeps that data and there are two African-American men arraigned one morning, it doesn't then mean we should be arraigning two Caucasian women. The data needs to be interpreted. That's a larger conversation. I believe the court should track the data. We need it to be uniform statewide, and that's what I believe. I also believe, as a prosecutor who knows the current system there for keeping records, it's called Damien. It's old. We need to update it. MDAA, the DA organization, needs funding to do that, and then it should be uniform across every county so we can compare data.
And again, all these other DA's offices are doing it, so
Okay.
Damien's not an excuse.
Let's move on to the next question. Now, Dan Higgins, we start with you this time. While it is the judges who ultimately decide on sentencing, what do you feel can be done about violent repeat offenders? I think many were surprised when Sergeant Sean Gannon was killed to learn that the man convicted of killing him had a very lengthy violent criminal record.
Sure. He was called by a number in the media that didn't represent how many cases he had or how many arrests he had. If I'm arraigned on 10 charges, let's say weapons charges or drug charges, and then I'm indicted, there's 10 charges arraigned in district and 10 arraigned in superior court. So that's 20 right there. That could be considered one case. That individual certainly had a record and had previously been prosecuted and sent to state's prison. I was part of that trial team of that murder case. It was a very meaningful case. I raised my hand to participate in it, and I was honored to be a part of that team. We split the case together, the first assistant, Mike Trudeau, and myself. We secured a conviction. We used what I referenced earlier, the Armed Career Offender Statute. And it's a rare tool, rare in this state, that is given to prosecutors. Because as you may remember, Mindy, prior to COVID, there was a movement across the country and in the state to get rid of all minimum mandatory sentences. The argument at the time being that it gives prosecutors too much power. As prosecutors, we have very few minimum mandatory sentences. We need to wield them carefully to make sure we're not treating people disparately. However, it is a tool we need for what you're referencing, the violent offenders. The Armed Career Criminal Statute is one tool that we use. And then sentencing structure. For instance, this individual is serving 10 to 15 before the life sentence, and then he's serving another 9 to 12 on and after for another trial I prosecuted him on a mayhem case following that murder.
Thank you. Same question, Robert Galibois.
Well, I'm actually going to answer the question. We're going to charge appropriately. We're going to charge the highest level that we can possibly charge for these violent offenders and these drug traffickers, and we're not going to break down the charges. That's a regular occurrence in our Superior Court. They talk about bringing certain armed career criminal charges, things of that sort, indicting trafficking at certain particular offenses, but routinely the charges are broken down. And it's just, you can go through the logs for year after year after year throughout the entirety of the present administration. Every time they bring these armed career criminal charges or these high-level drug offenses, they always break them down, and I will not do that.
Mindy, may I reply?
Go ahead.
Number one, in Mr. Galibois' opening, I'd like to correct. He said he was the lead prosecutor on 15 murders. That's not correct. I think he meant defense attorney because he's defended those murder charges. With respect to what he just referenced, I would ask Mr. Galibois to release over the last 20 years how many drug dealers he has represented on drug dealing charges, not only on the Cape and Islands and Plymouth, where his office is, where his house is, but also across the state. Because let's be transparent. That is a hot topic these days. And let's talk about that. We're talking about the safety of the Cape and Islands, where I have been serving this community for 13 years. I do agree with him. We need to take a strong stance on drug dealers, but he needs to be transparent and disclose how many people he's represented on drug dealing charges over the last 20 years.
Robert.
Let's continue the transparency. I've been living in Barnstable Village since February with my wife. We're empty nesters as our kids are off in college right now. So it's no secret. We lived in Bourne for about 20 years. We moved closer to Boston when our kids had a chance to go to school and so we moved up to the South Shore area. But we came back in February, or I came back and my wife came back about 2 months ago as our younger boy has gone off to college. So we live in Barnstable Village. They want to try to put me off the Cape. I've been living here since February after living in Bourne for 20 years, and I've spent my entire 27 years practicing on the Cape.
Do you want to take another minute to address the defense attorney part of this question?
That's my role at the moment. I represent people that are accused.
All right.
Mindy, I just want to briefly reply to his reply for 2 seconds here. I understand he's saying he lived in Bourne for a long time. I do credit that. I understand he's saying he's renting an apartment now in Barnstable as part of this campaign. I credit that. But looking at his political contributions, which are an open source item, he's been living in Kingston and Norwell, off Cape, since 2015, where his political contributions have been going, including to Maura Healey, $1,000 during his campaign here, and over $4,000 to Democrats since he has announced office.
I've been living in Barnstable since February, and I didn't have the benefit of donating $1,000 to my campaign like Mr. Higgins did to his own campaign. I can only donate $100.
All right, let's move on to the next question. Robert Galibois, we start with you. We sort of mentioned earlier that sometimes diversion is an option. That's an alternative procedure in a criminal case where the prosecution is interrupted through a deal between the defendant and the prosecutor, where the prosecutor either dismisses the charges completely or does not bring any charges to begin with. What factors should be considered when you're determining if a person is qualified?
If someone comes in with a low-level misdemeanor that's a non-violent offense, and we have reasonable assurances that this particular conduct was an aberration, that is, that we're not going to see this person again, and they're willing to commit to us either certain hours of community service or whatever treatment might be appropriate, then we're willing to engage with that particular person to divert the prosecution if we deem it appropriate. This has been going on. It was born basically out of the juvenile court system. It has grown into the adult system. A lot of DA's offices, in terms of the adult system, cap it. They have an age cap around 21 years of age. I try to be a logical person. I would utilize the diversion program in the adult session as well, and I wouldn't necessarily have an age cap. Someone can make their first mistake, so to speak, in their late 20s, 30s, or even 40s and beyond. If we feel that is, again, an aberration and this person's not going to be coming back into the system again, we'd be willing to work with them.
Thank you. Same question for you, Daniel Higgins.
This is a great area where I can agree with Mr. Galibois. We have a diversion program. He's right. Across the state, it started off as a juvenile diversion program, and then it expanded to 21, and then expanded to all adults. There was a recent change in the law a couple years ago that also gives the court the authority to do their own diversions. It's not often seen, but it is a separate statute. In our office, we've had over 5,000 graduates from our diversion program, Cape Codders who have graduated from the program, and the goal is to prevent recidivism. If we can target the issue that led to their minor offense, and the key point is that they're willing to work with us because they have to sign a contract. And it can be very empowering for a young person if they've made a minor mistake, they accept diversion. We're stepping up to them saying, we'll give you a chance without arraignment, and it gives them then the chance to own their own future. And that can be a very empowering thing for a young person who may not have had a role model to prevent the issue, to guide them prior to that. So we put the ball in their hands, and then we have them go to counseling, write an essay, do community service, stay out of trouble for 6 months, and ultimately they can graduate from the program and not be arraigned. It is appropriate for minor offenses, young people often, and people who are, most importantly, willing to work with us and sign that contract.
If I could just ask a question, of that 5,000 figure, how many were adults?
I don't have the stat. But adults, if I could respond to that, adults were recently expanded, and that's in the last few years. I don't know what year it was, but the governor's bill on the crime updates 4 or 5 years ago also expanded it to adults by law for the court system as well.
All right. Let's go. Next question, Daniel Higgins, we start with you. We hear a lot about implicit bias and its role in racial disparity in the criminal justice system. How would you address this within the DA's office?
Sure. There are, obviously, it's a big topic in the community. Everyone wants to make sure that everyone is being treated fairly. As prosecutors, we have to be aware, right, of any implicit bias or a bias you're not even aware of. That's something that training is ongoing for in the legal community. The judges have been doing it, implicit bias training. But our calling is to treat people as individuals. So what we do is we read a police report at arraignment. What was the crime? We read the record or lack of record that the person has, court activity record. And we also look at community support. Often we get letters from the person's church, from their high school, from their teacher, from their employer, and we look at the individual and treat them as an individual. With respect to bias, there have been studies over the last few years. We saw Com v. Long, recent case before the passing of Judge Gantz, and that provides an avenue to someone who thinks they were racially profiled in a car stop to get extra discovery. They have to meet an initial burden, but that provides them an avenue to look into the history of that officer if they believe it was a racially motivated stop. We've also seen other studies come out of Salem State College, for example, evaluating the stops across the state and saying that it was on par, they believed, with the population. Numbers are a tricky thing. They have to be reliable numbers, and there are groups out there who want the numbers to be one way or the other. Our calling as prosecutors is to not look at race. It is to make decisions on facts, on criminal records, on victim input. This is a very human and personal thing when you're dealing with victims and dealing with defendants. Our calling is to make sure people are treated fairly. And the best check on that, Mindy, in my opinion, is the courtroom is open to the public. Sometimes it's not in other countries, and that's a problem. Here, the media can be in there any day. So can any member of the public. I invite them. Come judge our court system.
Thank you. Same question, Robert Galibois.
Well, I'm going to go back to keeping data. I believe there's 23 or 24 assistant district attorneys, or at least there are that number of positions. I believe they've been down a number of prosecutors for a while. But when you're talking about having 23 or 24 different assistant district attorneys, reading these reports that's been suggested, reading these records or lack of records that's been suggested, these are individual prosecutors that are reviewing cases on their own without necessarily consulting with other prosecutors. And we don't necessarily know what the ultimate decision was. That's why we need to keep data to guard against whatever implicit biases that are in play. By keeping the data, we get to actually see what is going on, how the cases are being handled, and we have the ability to go back later on to evaluate it. And we need to share that data so we can open up ourselves to criticism from other entities, including the public.
Thank you. We are talking with the candidates who are running for Cape and Islands District Attorney. 866-999-4626 is our number if you have a question you'd like to pose to both candidates. Our email address, thepoint@capeandislands.org. We'll talk more after a break. You're listening to The Point. We have with us this morning the candidates running for District Attorney for the Cape and Islands, Democrat Robert Galibois and Republican Daniel Higgins. 866-999-4626 is our number. Our email address is thepoint@capeandislands.org. And Robert Galibois, I think it's your turn to go first. Chris in Vineyard Haven says, how would you use the power of the District Attorney to address convictions that would, with the benefit of hindsight, are inconsistent with current jurisprudence and societal values? Joint venture felony murder convictions are one example.
Well, you can set up an integrity review team to review prior convictions. And ideally, the review team had nothing to do with the underlying case itself, of course. And it goes through the particular process to reevaluate the evidence to see whether or not the verdict that was rendered in that particular case matches what the true evidence was.
Same question, Daniel Higgins.
Sure, and conviction integrity units are a new thing. What I would suggest is we try and make sure all convictions are fair, obviously. If we felt, or the court felt, after the trial, that the verdict or the sentence was inappropriate, we have the ability to bring forward an illegal sentence under a special statute, and the court has the ability to set aside convictions that may not comport with law at that time. When things change down the road, there's often an appeal filed, and then we have the ability to look at it and treat it as it should be treated. We do agree to appeals where a law may have changed, etc., and we fight the appeals where the conviction is appropriate. We see appeals always on homicide convictions, and we have a great rate of securing and maintaining those convictions of murders on Cape Cod.
Thank you. We'll start with you this time, Daniel Higgins. The DA's office determines which cases to prosecute and also what type of sentencing to recommend. What factors do you think are important to consider? And I'm thinking, we talked the difference between, a drug user and a drug dealer, but what are the factors when you decide whether you're going to prosecute? And same thing with sentencing.
Sure. I believe at looking at a person as an individual. If they're pro se, we can talk with them directly. If they're represented by counsel, then we speak with counsel. They provide us community input, which can be very important sometimes. It can help us determine if this person's been helping the community, leading a good life. This is an aberration. And we can also tell from a person's criminal record if they're the opposite, if what they did was out of true evil intentions, targeting someone in a very heated domestic, et cetera. And in those situations, we look at the record and we look at penalties that are appropriate to send the message to someone who won't listen to the court system, to a probation officer, to someone speaking to them as a counselor, because their history has shown they won't listen. One of the things that doesn't get enough attention is victim input. A lot of our job is behind closed doors. We meet with victims about their input. Some people are too scared to testify, Mindy. It happens all the time. Other people are brave enough to testify. I've met with some women, including here in Falmouth, who were one moment away from death. And in the particular case here, someone from the community broke a door open and saved her life. I can tell you it is a humbling experience to meet with these people in their time of fear and need, and it is amazing to see them stand up for themselves and testify. We try and support victims to the degree we are allowed to. We try and make them comfortable with the process, and we prosecute the case as appropriate. Victim input is my answer. We have to be conscious of victim input always. And sometimes it can be out of line or inappropriate for the crime. And that's where we come in and we say, this is the Commonwealth's case. This is the penalty that is appropriate. We know you want him in jail forever, but this one is a minor offense. And there are serious cases such as stabbings, bad domestics, mayhem, near homicides, where we need to put our foot down and victims have a right to be heard without a plea happening, without them knowing. We'd never want that to happen. We want victims to have notice and to have the opportunity to address the court because that's their right.
Robert Galibois, same question.
Domestic violence cases obviously are crucially important, and we need to do all we can to work with victims of domestic violence to provide them the services that they need to, one, get through the experiences that they've gotten through, and then also, of course, prepare them for the court process and assist them along the way to try to make it as easy as possible for them to work with the prosecutor's office so we can punish the offender. When it comes to the drug dealing type of cases, you look to see who might be the addict that's selling to support their addiction and who is truly in the business. And by doing that, you try to look for layers of insulation. As you can examine a particular drug case, if someone's charged with a high-level drug offense, you look to see if there are protections in place by the defendant to try to obscure his identity in the drug trafficking role. And that's how you identify who's actually in the business and try to punish that particular person as opposed to the person that is suffering from substance abuse disorder and try to get them treatment where possible. So you have to carefully analyze the circumstances as they present themselves. And I am a big proponent of what goes on in the federal court that you don't see too much here in the state court. When someone is sentenced, the probation department actually puts together about a 40-page report about the history of that individual. And I would certainly call upon it's incumbent upon defense attorneys to provide as much information as possible as to their client so the prosecutor can make that particular decision. When you see a lack of a record or certain entries in a record, that certainly gives you some information about the person. But you've got to go well beyond what appears on a record and try to get letters of references and dig deeper as to who this individual is so you can seek out the appropriate punishment.
Thank you. Paul is giving us a call from West Tisbury. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
What's
Good
your
morning.
question? Yeah, what's your question for the candidates?
Well, my question is about how the present district attorney's office handled not just the Krista McAuliffe case, but this young man, Howe, 38-year-old man, killed his mother, a well-respected woman in Truro, and Michael O'Keefe's office sent him, and they covered it up by saying they couldn't get him into a mental health facility. We
So,
couldn't
Paul,
hit the
let me just stop for a second. So, Paul, is your question how would you handle mental health cases? Is that your question?
And how would each one of these candidates have handled this particular matter with this young man?
All right, thank you for the call, Paul. So let's expand it to how would you handle mental health cases such as this, but not
Okay.
specifically this case. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, I mean, that's why, in terms of mental health cases, that's why I think it's vitally important that we launch a mental health specialty session in our district courts. So again, as I mentioned earlier, that's a session where you bring in trained professionals to work with a defendant to get to the core issue that they're struggling with to try to treat it and therefore reduce recidivism. In the case that's being mentioned right now, I think there's still a lot of open questions as to how this all played out. It's quite fresh. It just happened a couple of days ago. I don't think all of the facts are out as of yet. I know the Globe put in a report this morning, but again, there's still a lot of outstanding questions. So I don't think it's really fair to try to go and analyze on that particular tragic case.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dan Higgins.
What I would say is, with respect to Mr. Galibois' answer about mental health courts, that's kind of a diversionary court and meant for lower level offenses. That wouldn't apply here. We're not going to be putting a man who murdered his mother potentially and burned her in the front yard into a mental health court. Mental health is an important topic. I have not seen the press release. I have not seen the Globe article this morning, but I'm generally aware of the situation. And I know that police and the DA's office tried to have this man sectioned, brought him to Cape Cod Hospital, and he ultimately was put into the care of a different county sheriff's department. I've heard that he has passed. I've heard that news. I don't know the details of his passing. But, Mindy, there's probably a risk anyone charged with murder who's left to their own thoughts in confinement, there's probably a risk of suicide there for any person charged with murder. And I think that's going to be a bigger conversation at the state level potentially with respect to resources for our houses of correction and our prisons to make sure that prisoners are properly monitored and watched. But I would suggest that anyone charged with a homicide charge is left with their thoughts, whether mental health is involved or not. And there could be a suicide risk there. Obviously, a sad situation overall. I haven't heard the full details yet, but it wouldn't be a mental health court type of case.
Actually, if I can respond to
Just
that.
real quick,
we were talking about mental health type defendants. We weren't addressing specifically this homicide case. Of course, in homicide cases, those are going to be treated quite differently. There is a state section on points referred to as Section 18 to address cases where someone's facing a serious offense like murder. So the question had to do with, your garden variety mental health cases, not necessarily a murder case.
I want to be able to give you both 2 minutes for closing, so I just want a quick answer to this question, and I think, Dan Higgins, we start with you. Just what would be your top priority if you were elected? Just about a minute.
The opiate problem. Our vulnerable citizens are being targeted by the opiate dealers. Fentanyl has made the opiates more deadly than ever. Before, when I started, it was OxyContin. It was people trying to steal pills from occupied and unoccupied homes, often from our seniors in their bathrooms. A lot of breaking and enterings that were occurring because of that, and then they were selling them at what we call pawn shops to feed what was often a $300 a day habit. Then it went to heroin. Heroin was cheaper, came from Mexico, was on our streets, and it was a cheaper habit. We saw less break-ins. Now fentanyl is in every illicit drug sale on the Cape. We've seen it in marijuana outside of dispensaries. It is a danger that everyone needs to be aware of. It is affecting our vulnerable citizens who might turn to drugs out of depression or pain. I will devote resources to education, to treatment, and to full prosecution of the dealers.
All right, Rob Galibois, top priority.
Public safety has to be the top priority of any district attorney, and there are different ways you get to public safety. I would join in that the opioid crisis is at the forefront of every single community. And again, I'm reminded about how we need to target those that are in the business of selling this poison to those that are struggling with substance use disorder. And when they are captured and we bring charges against them, that we don't exercise any discretion in those types of cases and prosecute them fully.
All right, we're going to go to closing comments now. And Rob Galibois, it's your turn to go first. You have 2 minutes.
Okay. When I started off, I said that this campaign was personal to me. When we began in January, we've made our way literally from Main Street, Buzzards Bay, all the way down to Commercial Street, Provincetown, and most of the villages in between. And we've been out to the islands now, I believe, a total of 18 times at this point. A consistent theme that we identify as a disconnect between the district attorney's office that's been in existence now for 48 years, essentially under the same administration. And a lot of people have no idea what the district attorney's office does. So to remedy that, we've come up with 3 specifics. 1, the hiring of a full-time community engagement officer whose exclusive responsibility will be in our communities every single day. And they'll report directly back to me. They're going to keep their finger on the pulse of the neighborhoods. They're not going to have an office. They're going to have a car, a cell phone, and a ferry ticket. That's the first thing. Secondly, we talked about launching a community coalition. We gave the name of the DA and us. There's going to be a chapter in every single town across the Cape and on each island. The coalitions will be made up of local elected officials like select board, school committee, police officers, and regular citizens, and they'll have regular meetings with our office. And finally, 65 employees in the DA's office. Every single one's going to commit to 4 hours of community service, including yours truly, to provide yet another avenue to remain connected to the people that we serve. I spoke at the outset about the words of Dan Wolf. And again, our district attorney's office will pursue the full realm of public safety, whether it's through rehabilitative services where appropriate and seeking and imposing punishment when necessary. When you do that, you achieve that goal of developing and building communities that are secure and humane.
Thank you very much, Daniel Higgins.
Thank you, Mindy. Ladies and gentlemen, again, my name is Dan Higgins. I've been a prosecutor on Cape Cod for 13 years. I have devoted my entire legal career to public safety and to working for the people of the Cape and Islands and the victims of violent crime. I have raised my hand and put my name into this race. I live in West Barnstable with my wife and my son in West Barnstable. I love this job. It's not very easy to just enter into a political race. But what I will say is this is not a political job. This is a professional one. I ask the voters to look at my resume and to look at my opponent's resume. What I can offer for myself is this. I train prosecutors across the state through our DA's organization, new prosecutors in Boston every year. I've attended and completed the National DA's course through the National DA's organization. I have supervised a team of 10 prosecutors for approximately 7 years as the district court supervisor and the district court chief. I have prosecuted cases in Superior Court for those 7 years all along. I have prosecuted every type of case on the Cape and Islands up to and including murder. I want to bring my experience to help public safety on Cape Cod. I have raised my hand. I ask for your vote, and I would be honored to be your next district attorney. And tonight, if you are so inclined to hear me speak or come ask some questions, I invite you to the Hyannis Conference Center with Governor Baker at 6 p.m. tonight in Hyannis. Thank you very much, Mindy. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you, Mr. Galibois.
Thank you. Daniel Higgins and Robert Galibois, thank you both for being here. If you missed any of this, it'll be up on our website, on our elections page, capeandislands.org. I'm Mindy Todd. Thanks for listening.
The Point is produced by Amy Vince. The executive producer is Mindy Todd. Production assistance from Jenny Junker and Dan Treidel. Theme music by Benjamin Verdery and William Coulter.